The property listing had been almost too good to be true. Colonial homestead on New Terrace, fully furnished, 3 acres of land, only 2,000 credits. David Chen had been looking for a fresh start, somewhere isolated, affordable, where he could rebuild after a difficult divorce had left him financially drained and emotionally exhausted. The seller was eager, almost pushy about finalizing the deal quickly. Just sign here and here. Standard colonial property transfer. You'll love the place, quiet, well-maintained, everything you need. David had skimmed the contract. It was dense with legal terminology, colonial statutes he didn't fully understand. But 2,000 credits for a house seemed incredible, and he was tired of looking. He signed. 3 days later, he arrived at the property with his few belongings, expecting to find it empty and ready for renovation. Instead, he found someone living there. A Velrani woman was in the kitchen when he entered, preparing food. She looked up at his arrival with an expression that mixed resignation and something darker, a kind of weary acceptance he didn't understand. "You're the new owner," she stated. Not a question. David set down his bag, confused. "I'm David Chen. I bought this house. I didn't realize someone was living here. Are you a tenant? Do we need to arrange new rental terms or—" "I'm not a tenant." Her voice was quiet, bitter. "I'm bound to the property. You own both. Didn't you read the contract?" "What?" She gestured at the documents in his hand. Section 47, subsection 8, colonial maintenance obligations. "I'm Sira. I'm classified as a bound servant under colonial law. When you bought the property, you bought the contract that binds me to it." David pulled out his copy of the contract, his hands suddenly shaking. He found the section, buried in dense legal terminology about property maintenance obligations and transferable service contracts pursuant to Colonial Charter Article 12. The reality slowly crystallized. Sira wasn't a tenant. She was legally considered part of the property, bound to serve whoever owned the house. "This is slavery," David said, his voice hollow. "This can't be legal." "It's legal under colonial law, has been for decades, and now you own both the house and me." Sira's tone was flat, as if she'd explained this before and knew how it would go. David felt sick. He'd been looking for a fresh start, for simplicity and isolation. Instead, he'd accidentally bought another human being, or rather, another person, since Sira was Velrani, but that distinction didn't make this any less horrific. "I don't want to own anyone," he said firmly. "You're free right now. You can leave, go wherever you want. I'm not enforcing this contract." Sira's expression didn't change. "You think you're the first owner to say that?" The second owner made the same speech. Then he realized it was cheaper to keep me bound than to pay for legal release. The third owner promised freedom after a year of service. Then he sold the property and me with it. "I'm not like them." "Maybe not, but it doesn't matter what you want. The binding contract is legal, and I can't just leave. If I try, I'm classified as a fugitive and can be legally detained and returned. Even if you give permission, I have no legal standing without an owner. I can't work, rent property, or access most colony services. The system is designed to keep people like me trapped." David stood in the kitchen of the house he'd bought, looking at the woman he'd accidentally enslaved, and realized he'd gotten far more than a fresh start. He'd gotten a moral crisis he couldn't walk away from. Over the following days, David researched colonial law obsessively, trying to understand how something this unjust could be legal in a modern society. The answer was disturbingly bureaucratic. Section 47 was a remnant from New Terrace's early settlement period, designed to provide labor when the colony population was small. Workers could bind themselves to property in exchange for transportation costs, housing, and basic needs. The system was supposed to be temporary, phased out as the colony became self-sufficient. But it had never been repealed. It remained on the books because it was profitable for property owners and politically difficult to challenge. Wealthy landowners lobbied to keep it, arguing it provided economic opportunity for workers who voluntarily entered contracts. The fact that these contracts were signed under duress, medical debts, family emergencies, economic desperation, was conveniently ignored. Sierra explained how she'd become bound. 5 years ago, her mother had fallen critically ill. The medical costs were staggering. A wealthy landowner had offered to pay the debts in exchange for a 20-year service contract. Sierra had signed, desperate to save her mother, not understanding that the contract made her legally property bound to the landowner's estate. I thought it was just employment, a job with a long contract. I didn't realize I was signing away my legal personhood. Her voice carried years of bitterness. When the landowner died, his heirs sold the property and me with it. I've been sold 3 times now. You're the 4th owner. That's horrific. That's legal. Under colonial law, bound servants aren't people with rights. We're property with maintenance requirements. David tried hiring a lawyer to challenge the binding contract. The consultation was brief and discouraging. Colonial courts didn't recognize bound servants as having standing to sue for freedom. Only the property owner could initiate release proceedings, which required extensive legal fees, bureaucratic processes, and could take years. Most owners don't bother, the lawyer explained. It's cheaper to keep the servant bound and sell them with the property if they want to divest. Your situation is unusual because you actually want to free her, but the system isn't designed for that outcome. David felt trapped by the same system that bound Sierra. He could symbolically reject the arrangement, but that wouldn't actually help her. She'd still have no legal standing, no way to support herself, nowhere to go. They established an uneasy coexistence. David refused to give Sierra orders or treat her as a servant. This is your home as much as mine, probably more. You've been here longer than I will be. We'll figure out the legal situation, but until then you're not my property. You're a person sharing this space. Sierra was deeply suspicious at first. The second owner said similar things. Then he started expecting me to cook, clean, and maintain the property without pay. Said it wasn't orders, just reasonable expectations of someone living here. I'll do my own cooking and cleaning. You're not obligated to do anything for me. That's not what the contract says. I don't care what the contract says. I'm not enforcing it. Days turned into weeks. David proved his words through consistent action. He cooked his own meals, cleaned his own space, handled property maintenance himself. When Sierra occasionally helped, he treated it as a favor from someone sharing the house, not as an obligation she owed. Slowly, cautiously, Sierra began to believe he was different. "Tell me about your life before the contract," David asked one evening as they shared the kitchen, separately preparing their own meals but coexisting in the space. Sierra was quiet for a long moment. "Why do you want to know?" "Because you're a person with a history that matters, not just a contract I accidentally signed. I was studying xenobiology. Wanted to do research on cross-species ecological interactions. I had plans, dreams, a future." Her voice was carefully controlled. "Then my mother got sick, and I signed those plans away to save her life. She died anyway 6 months into my service contract. The illness was too advanced, so I gave up everything for nothing." "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry, help me get free." David had been working on exactly that. Direct legal challenge would take years and cost money he didn't have. But he'd found another approach. Colonial law allowed for transfer of property ownership. If Sierra owned the property, she'd effectively own herself. The binding contract would become meaningless because she'd be both the owner and the person bound to serve the owner. "It's a legal paradox," David explained, showing her the research. "If you own the property and the contract binds you to serve the property owner, then you're obligated to serve yourself. The binding becomes unenforceable." Sierra processed this. "That's actually clever, but property transfers require approval from colonial authorities. Why would they approve transferring property to a bound servant?" "Because technically, There's no law against it. The system assumes owners won't do it because it would free their servants. But I'm not trying to keep you bound. I'm trying to free you using the system's own rules. They filed the transfer paperwork. The colonial property office was immediately suspicious. Why are you transferring valuable property to a bound servant? The clerk asked, clearly skeptical. Because it's my property and I can transfer it to whoever I want. Is there a law preventing me from doing so? No, but this is highly irregular. We'll need to review this carefully. The review took weeks. Colonial authorities questioned David's motives, his finances, whether this was some kind of fraud or tax evasion scheme. Some officials warned him that setting this precedent could destabilize the labor system that several wealthy landowners relied on. Good, David said bluntly during one inquiry. If the labor system is built on treating people as property, it should be destabilized. The case drew attention from colonial reform advocates who've been trying to abolish the binding system for years. Media coverage highlighted Sira's story and the legal absurdity of the binding contract system. Public pressure built. The colonial government faced a choice: block the transfer and openly defend treating people as property, or approve it and risk the precedent it would set. They approved the transfer. The moment the transfer was finalized, Sira became the legal owner of the property, and simultaneously the person bound to serve that property's owner. She was both master and servant. The paradox made the binding contract legally meaningless. She was free. Sira sat in the kitchen of the house that was now legally hers, staring at the property documents as if they might dissolve if she looked away. I don't understand, she said quietly. Why? You could have kept me bound, used me as free labor, sold the property and me together for profit. Why go through all this trouble to free me? Because you're a person who deserves freedom and dignity, not property to be exploited. David said this as if it were obvious, which to him it was. That simple. That simple, though I'll admit the legal process was more complicated than I expected. The local authorities tried to challenge the transfer, arguing David had exploited a legal loophole to undermine the servant binding system. But his documentation was impeccable. He'd followed every regulation, paid every fee, satisfied every requirement. The transfer was legal, even if its purpose was something the system never anticipated. The case became a flashpoint. Reform advocates used it to highlight the absurdity and cruelty of the binding system. Media investigations found hundreds of people across the colony living in similar bondage, their stories varying in detail, but sharing the common thread of exploitation disguised as legal contract. Within 6 months, the colonial legislature was forced to address the issue. Section 47 and the entire binding servant framework were repealed. Hundreds of people were freed from contracts that had stolen years of their lives. For David and Sira, the legal victory was important but also personal. She was free to leave, to go anywhere, to rebuild the life that had been taken from her 5 years ago. Instead, she chose to stay. Why? David asked when she told him. Because you proved something I'd stopped believing, that someone could see me as a person worth helping rather than property to exploit. Because this place, she looked around the house that was now legally hers, this place was a prison for 5 years. But with you, it started becoming a home. I want to see what we can build here together, as equals, as partners, as friends. They turned the property into a support center for formerly bound servants, helping others navigate freedom after years of legal servitude. Sira used her education, the xenobiology studies she'd abandoned, to develop agricultural programs that gave freed servants marketable skills. David used his administrative background to help them navigate the legal and financial systems that had previously been inaccessible. A year after David had signed that contract believing he was just buying a house, he and Sira stood together watching the 10th group of freed servants graduate from their support program. I thought I bought a house, David reflected. Turns out I bought an injustice I couldn't ignore. You bought a house, Sierra corrected. And then you chose to see me as a person worth freeing. That choice changed everything for me, for the hundreds who were freed when the law was repealed, for everyone who won't be trapped by that system in the future. You did most of the work, building this program, helping others. You gave me the freedom to do it. You could have exploited the system like everyone else. Instead, you dismantled it. Sierra smiled, something she'd done more frequently over the past year as the weight of bondage had lifted. That matters. David looked at the center they'd built, at the lives being changed, at the woman who'd been treated as property, but had proven to be an extraordinary partner and friend. Best 2,000 credits I ever spent, he said. You spent 2,000 credits on a house. You spent months